debate. The affirmative team is, who's that? Who is F?
Oh, Kahurangi-Marlborough.
You're CM? Oh, no, are you KM or CM?
KM.
Okay, alright, cool. And you guys are CM. Yeah, right, perfect. And this is the light text motion.
Yeah.
Right, cool. So we're just going to do a quick round of introductions and then get straight into the debate. So my name is Andre. I will be your solo chair for this round. If the affirmative team could introduce yourself, let me know if you're going to reply. Then the same with negating, and then we'll kind of get into it.
Okay, my name's Thora, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm doing first.
My name is Emerald, I go by she, her, and I'm second and reply.
My name is Asa, I'm third speaker.
My name is Alex, I'm first and leaders.
My name is Kadao, second speaker.
My name's Manuya, I speak third.
Alright, cool. So just as a heads up, I'll be using an app at the time. You will hear one bell at a minute, one bell at 7. That is your POI timing. You'll hear 1 or 2 bells at 8. At 8:15, I'm just going to stop listening and writing entirely, so kind of be wrapped up by then. Cool. We're good to start, so that's 7 speakers. I can just read it.
On the affirmative side of the house, we strongly believe that instituting a land value tax will be beneficial to all New Zealanders and bridge the gap of wealth inequality in New Zealand. On my first point, I will prove that we're going to increase the productive capacity of New Zealand, and in my second point, we will show how we're going to provide better outcomes to marginalised communities. And my second speaker will talk about our split on government policy. To start off with a little bit of characterization about what people we believe will be owning this land. I mean, what value this land, how will this land will be valued? So just to start off, if you have like a flat, fertile piece of land that could be well-utilised piece of farmland, it will be valued very high because this will be based off like the productivity value of this land. This could be examples as prime real estate in like the Wellington CBD. This would be high value. But what about low value land? Well, we see this as being like places in like housing and poorer areas where there wouldn't be like much productivity value. So there would be like a minimal tax in these areas. So moving on to my first point about increasing productivity. So first of all, we want to see who is buying this high value land. We see that often it's people who are well off buying this large areas of land, and they only have like a house on it. Maybe they've built themselves a golf course. They're just not using it to like the biggest extent it could be used, which is just like not at all valuable to the New Zealand economy. Being taxed highly on this valuable land will give them incentive to turn this land into to make this land productive, so they can get an income to pay for this tax. So what does this look like? This looks like turning it into farmland. This looks like building houses to rent out. This looks like increasing our New Zealand economy, which is like incentivizing them to use this land productively. But who else owns valuable land? So the other people we see owning this land are people like farmers. So even in places with this production already happening, it's not always maximized to the greatest extent. So because of this added tax, these farmers have like an incentive to maximize the productivity to gain the most amount of money they can, which will then be paid towards this tax, which A, benefits them because they get more money themselves, but also again benefits our system because we have like more, like can invest in these better systems, these more efficient ways to farm and such, which is just like an overall increase in economy. But let's say we take this at the worst case. So let's say rich people can just pay off their tax without increasing the productivity of the land. Well, this is still a benefit because at the very least they're still putting money back into the economy. So we don't see this necessarily being a bad thing. And we actually see, as we'll talk more about in a second, that this money often goes back more into the people, and therefore it still like overall benefits New Zealand. So second of all, what if like these farmers somehow have the most perfect, most maximized farm, and there's nothing they can do to improve it? We once again see that these people are likely to be very well off because of that, and therefore they have no struggle to pay this tax in the first place. So what are the outcomes of this? Well, first of all, working on increasing the output will be like investing in technology and capital goods, which is in the best interest of landowners for more money for themselves. But what it also creates is more jobs for people with like a more increased pay. which just like uplifts the communities in these areas because there are way more job opportunities to like a higher skill set for this technology, which requires more pay. So overall, what do we see? We see more productivity from this land, which way benefits New Zealand because of the output. We might see more food if it was farmland, which makes food cheaper in New Zealand. We would see more houses, which makes like the housing prices better. We just see overall the output is better. But even in our worst case, if there's somehow the productivity doesn't change at all, where they will still be these rich people will still be contributing to the economy through this tax, which will create like a more stable economy and benefit New Zealand. I'll take a point now.
This debate is not just set in New Zealand. How does your side of the house engage with international examples of like land sales practices?
Well, we don't see this necessarily being any different in other cases. Well, I used New Zealand as a real example because we have a lot of farmland in New Zealand. But if we use the example of like places in the city, they're still not being used in a productive way as like a business or such, which can extend to other countries. So I don't see why this is super important because we can just like assume our arguments still exist in other areas of the world. So moving on to my second point about how we can provide better outcomes in marginalized communities. So first of all, currently like low value land bought by like on low value land bought by like lower positions, there are like worse conditions. We can just see this as being true in all countries around the world. Which means like stuff like the infrastructure is poor, maybe their housing isn't great, and maybe there are not many job opportunities. So what we see from this is there's no investment into these communities from like outside businesses because they have no interest in these people. So what does this mean? This means that if they have a much lower land tax, smaller businesses have like a much higher incentive to go to these places because they know they're not putting as much money into this tax, which means they actually want to like invest in these communities now because it's cheaper for them to start off their business. So we can see this because like obviously companies don't want to lose money, so they're going to go to these places. So what does this mean? First of all, it means these companies can develop in these lower income places, which means that these people now get better jobs. We also see that this doesn't change the low land tax because, as mentioned in the info slide, it doesn't depend on like the housing or anything like that in the land. Therefore, the tax will stay the same. But now we've got like these communities that people have invested in, these businesses thriving, which is giving these people jobs. So what does this mean? This means that building into these areas because of the tax benefits, often like we see these people gaining more experience for jobs, which makes it like easier for them to like uplift themselves in these from these low socioeconomic areas. This can mean they can get like a better job, a better paid job. They maybe like can get a better education. We also see this being like in things like more infrastructure in these communities, which obviously benefits the people in these communities as things like better housing and stuff. So what are the outcomes of this? Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, we can improve housing, like the situation for these people, because now they've got jobs, now they can afford these things. Also, the companies have like an interest in making these places like a bit nicer for people to come and invest in them. So what does this mean? We have like safer and healthier communities in these lower socioeconomic areas. So why is this good? Well, first of all, increasing infrastructure doesn't increase the tax benefit, like the tax being paid, which means these people aren't like getting any worse off because of this. And we also see this like bridges the wealth gap because these rich people are now having to pay these taxes, making their land productive, and these people in lower socioeconomic areas now have like ability to get these jobs to move up the line, and therefore like we're actually bridging this gap and improving the economy in these places. So what does this mean? This means children grow up healthier. This means these whole families can like have a better future. And they have less time being like stuck in these like cycles of poverty, these poor living conditions, unable to get a job. Now they have job experience, they can get more jobs, their overall living conditions improve. And like as they're uplifted, they have better jobs, better education. So in my first point, as I mentioned, to maximize the productive capacity, people will use this land to its best. So when we allow infrastructure to increase, there's a higher demand for people trained in these areas, which directly benefits the people to incentive to pursue a better education. Plus, there are still going to be base level jobs, which just overall means that people with a better education have a chance for these higher level jobs, but also people who are unable to get this education have job options available for them. So in the worst case, even if this means there's only a little bit of new infrastructure in these poorer communities and a couple more jobs, that is still a vast improvement, and we've still bridged this wealth gap. So what does this mean? At the end of this, my speech, you should know that we have increased our land productivity in the short term, and in the long term, we've been uplifting people out of poverty and bridging this wealth gap that we have in our communities. So even at our worst case, where the owners of this land don't care about the tax, they can just pay it off, they don't increase the productivity of the land, that money is still going back into the economy, therefore it's still helping those in poverty through the infrastructure, and as my second speaker will talk about, and still a massive benefit to us. Thank you.
We thank the first speaker of the affirmative piece of their speech, and we would now like to welcome the first speaker of the negating team up to take the floor and present the case.
tell. Look, clearly the other side of the house is unclear on what the motion actually means and what we're even debating about in this round. Let me tell you what we're actually debating. 3 things in this debate. Firstly, why land will fluctuate in value. Secondly, why this disincentivizes development of infrastructure. Thirdly, how land is devalued. But firstly, on response to the affirmative first speaker's case. First, affirmative's biggest push here is about cheapness and also the economy and jobs. We hear a lot about how a land tax allows a cheaper, better economic situation. What Aff fails to look at is cities such as Auckland or Melbourne with high living costs. Affirmative fails to see how this is actually really unbeneficial to a lot of people who are living in these cities. Aff also never specifically specifies or characterizes what this tax is or what this tax value is. What we think is that it's going to be a lot lower than what they're actually trying to push it to be. Also, there's no incentive to let land sit, unlike how affirmative tries to push. Why? Well, 2 main reasons. Firstly, because land is expensive and buyers want return, but also because land is valuable to farmers and companies who will want to build on it. Okay, let's move on to my first point on why land will fluctuate in value. Okay, well, society needs to grow and progress through consistent innovation of infrastructure. I'm sure we can all agree on this. As time moves on, we need to keep up with the times and we need to develop more. This means land will be a necessity in development. Therefore, as we need more land, we're going to be using the land, and in such, there's going to be less land over time. Therefore, the remaining land will only get increasingly more expensive. This means extreme pricing causing the land to become inaccessible. This can result in land values becoming unstable and also difficult to acquire. So let's move on to why this disincentivizes sustainable development. Okay, so firstly, why do people buy land in the current status quo? Well, the main reason here is investment, right? They want to do this one-time payment, and this means there's no more later burdening payments on them in the future. But how exactly do people get investments? Well, it looks like people talking to potential businesses or companies looking to put buildings and infrastructure on this land. For example, I own a land. Maybe I'll talk to Vodafone or ASB, and they want to put a land here. So I'll say, okay, cool. You just have to pay me 3% or whatever. Something like that, right? So in exchange for building on the landowner now gets a percentage cut from the company, or they get paid a fee. This is really good for 2 reasons. Because firstly, landowner profits off of the investment, and secondly, the company builds for a good deal. So how does this disincentivize development of infrastructure? Well, the landowner is now taxed. This means that there is an incentive to charge more, right? This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, the landowner needs to be able to pay the amount of the annual tax, but also because they need to pay a profit off of the investment. So the investment of buying land is paid off. So what do these infrastructure building businesses do when the prices will start to increase? Well, they need to do 2 things. Firstly, they need to cut corners when it comes to building. This looks like cheap timber or faulty or unstable building. But it also looks like these companies will start to increase prices for people utilizing these buildings. So this means the cost of renting an apartment is likely to increase, as we mentioned earlier, high living cost places, Auckland or Melbourne, are likely to have more expensive buildings. So what does this mean? Well, it means 2 things. Again, it means firstly, buildings that people rely on are built to a low standard to cut down on increased costs from land value tax. But also, secondly, the people relying on these buildings have to pay more, such as, again, the cost of living starts to increase. Now, we want to weigh this really heavily on how much people are harmed, right? Okay, we get this short-term benefit. Okay, maybe something happens on this side of the house. But on our side of the house, a lot of people are going to be harmed by this. A lot of people who need a place to stay, a lot of people who need a place to live are going to be harmed by this. And every single year, the house living crisis is going to get more and more worse. The only thing this tax is going to do is make it a lot worse from here. Note this also responds to the affirmative's case about jobs and economic and stuff like that. And yes, I will take a point now.
Yeah, so you mentioned how in bigger cities you don't understand how infrastructural development is actually going to lower the cost of living. Do you not think that having better job opportunities, having maybe more businesses that can have like lower prices and increased competition will just like offer like a lower cost of living for people in those cities?
I think the issue here is that even if we do, like, even if Affirmative does come up here and claim this benefit, the issue is like the cost of living in these like cities are still going to increase. So it really starts to cancel each other out. So there's like really no like real outcome here. Like, okay, sure, let's say we get more jobs and let's say we get more income, but if the cost of housing like starts to increase again and you need to pay more to rent, then really what are you trying to achieve here? You're achieving nothing, and that's the issue here. Okay, on to my third point on how land is devalued. Okay, what is the context here? Well, the land of value is quite linear. This means that, like in saying when time increases, the price of land will also rise. So if something like a land value tax, it works against this linear relationship as it brings back the land value. Okay, on to my next. Firstly, the incentive of land is linear with time, as we've already mentioned. In the long term, the land value will be lowered exponentially due to the land value tax. Let me walk you through how this happens step by step. Okay, firstly, this land is on sale. Awesome. Now someone comes in and buys land. Great. Now let's say the tax is applied somewhere around here. What happens now is the land is going to start losing value over time. And the owner of the land no longer wants to buy the land. They no longer want the land because it's losing value. Which links into the second mechanic here, which is the desirability of land and how it decreases. When the land is losing value over time, it starts to lose desirability. Then this means two things. Firstly, people who hold the land, they don't want it anymore. But secondly, no one wants to buy the land due to a lack of actual worth here. So this also means, number three, people will foresee a market drop and they're actually going to exploit this market drop. When the government goes out and say publicly, okay, in a year's time, we're going to put in this tax, people are going to foresee a market drop because they know, okay, the value of land is linear, which means the holders of the land are likely going to possibly try and exploit this and get rid of all of the lands at high prices before the market drop, which works really badly for their side. So let's say someone comes in here and they say, okay, I need to get rid of this land really quickly. I'm going to sell it now at $30 million. But no one's going to buy it, right? Because it's really just pushing a really high price. Whereas in a few months, suddenly it drops to $1 million, okay? Yes, I will also not speak about the POI if there is one. Awesome. Okay, I'll now move on to the impacts of this point. First things first, we get less value of land, meaning landowners start to lose money. And I think this is a real push on our side of the house. People who already own land are getting really stumped by this issue. They're coming in and saying, okay, we're going to put in this tax, but people who already own land are now saying, okay, so I'm losing money. And that's not a really good thing. But certainly current landowners will begin to try desperately to sell their land, as we've already said. This was land being sort of half of what it originally is, cut up the original price after the tax is implemented, right? So why is this really bad? Well, there's no incentive to actually keep the land now because there's no stable upward profit. In turn, this causes horrible economic consequences. There's no actual reason for this land to be owned by them because they can't make any profit. And instead, as was mentioned earlier in this speech, people need land to be able to innovate and be able to build their society and keep up with the time. But also small companies and private investors have no incentive to buy land because it's constantly fluctuating. So at the end of the debate, what have we told you? We told you you need to scale our side of the house based on the amount of people that we're impacting, okay? We're saying, okay, let's do this thing. It's going to make the land whatever, and a couple more jobs. Amazing. But so much more people now are going to have to pay higher prices for their houses, are going to have to lose out on possible opportunities because, again, we need to have land to progress society. I think Affirmative here fails to see that when they do this land tax thing and they offer all of these jobs, it cuts down on the opportunities that way as well. Opposed.
Cool. We thank the first speaker of the Negating team for their speech, and would now like to invite the second speaker of the Affirmative team up to continue their speech.
Sorry. What the negating side has shown us so far is that they don't understand the concept of having an inherent value of the land to begin with. This leads into what they have told us about people being like incentivized to sell the land off because they are desperate to like earn money afterwards because they're struggling to cost of the pay. And so therefore, in today's debate, I'm going to prove to you and reiterate why these people who buy expensive land are going to be capable to pay these high taxes and over why this is going to be beneficial to us. So what I'm going to do in today's debate is I'm going to start off with my rebuttal and some of the points they've brought up in their first speaker's speech, and then I'm going to be going on to my split on what like the government implementation of like policy is going to be with these like taxes and these earnings they're getting from this. And this is really important because our path to victory today is to prove to you why we are going to like divide wealth inequality and why this is something they are not going to claim on their side. Now, on to my rebuttal. So first of all, I just want to talk back on the move, right? We see on the info slide that like it tells that that lands have like inherent value based on like the progress it shows or like the developmental capacity that it shows, right? This means that if like Thor has given you like examples of this is like a piece of land that has like a lot of like farming capacity is going to be like ranked higher, right? And so like we already told you like that these people who own like large amounts of land who have like this developmental capacity are going to be like richer people, right? Therefore they're going to be able to like pay this tax over time because they already have like enough money to buy that like large amount of land. But we also see that overall because of the incentives of rich people to like keep their wealth, right, to like keep their land, they are going to develop this land over time so they can cover that cost, right? And this is really important because some of the stuff they brought up in their first speaker's speech is about how like people who buy this land are now not going to be able to like pay for it, which is not true. So what if they told us? They basically told us that like the land is going to like fluctuate in value over time, right? So they tell us that like the land is going to become more expensive over time because like more land is going to be in demand because they like need to like develop land. We agree that like land needs to be developed, right? And this is like a very important point because this is gonna like this is how we're going to like bridge like the divide in wealth inequality, right? Like we tell you that like already this land has like inherent value to begin with, right? It is being sold with an inherent price because of the inherent developmental capacity. Furthermore, like the MOO already tells us that like any buildings, any land that is built on it isn't going to affect the tax that is put on it, right? Because like property that is built on this doesn't affect the tax. So unless you are like fully like increasing the developmental capacity to the point at which like it cannot develop anymore, you are not going to see this tax like decrease at all, right? So what else do they tell us? They tell us that like they tell us like this that this land is going to lose value over time, right? That the like we tell you like already I've said this that the only possible like way this could be true is that if the development is like maximized, right, to the point where like it can't develop anymore because this land is like inherently got this price based on like the developmental capacity, right? So this means that like overall like these rich people who own it, right, they're going to be developing this land as Thor has told you, right? I'll tell you that they're going to be like developing this, right? So overall, like even if they are like wanting to sell this, right, because it's like too expensive or whatnot, we tell you like this probably isn't true because one, they're already rich to begin with, so they can cover this. But two, they are already going to be like developing this. They are incentivized to develop to earn an income so they can cover this. So overall, we see this really expensive land that I focus on so far that has this like insane like developmental capacity is going to be like developed by the rich people. This is important. I'll take a POI now.
Can you give me some reasons as to why rich people who own this land are likely to just let it sit if they need to pay off their investment?
Okay, well, first of all, like we see currently under the status quo that like rich people buy a lot of land because like they can and they like the view, right? So like they have these houses that they build on these like big plots of land and they aren't really doing anything. We've given you examples like maybe they'll build a tennis court or a pool or like a golf course, right? But they're not like incentivized to like exactly like develop anything yet, right? Because they already have all this money and they're already earning it, right? But let's say we implement the tax. This means that they're actually being taxed on their money and they actually need to start like paying it back, right? So what do? They start developing their land so they can directly earn an income from the land and pay back that tax. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the split, right? And this is really important because what we want to focus on today is like fixing like marginalized communities, right? Because we have identified the issue is that rich people are holding this land, right? They are not developing it. They are not reinvesting into the economy. And this is bad because it means that we have this huge wealth gap and this will be our path to victory. So what are the issues with the economy today, right? We see that like there is a lot of debt, right? The country owes a lot of debt and they end up like paying this off to like offshore accounts, right? Into like international countries. And we are not seeing this money like directly coming back into our economy. It's going just straight out of our economy. We also see that currently there are a lot of cuts in like social like development, or there are like a lot of cuts in areas that develop directly to the people. This is seen with like pay equity, right? That would directly like increase pay. This is seen in like the effects of post-COVID of like having to struggle to rebuild the economy and people are being left behind. And this is just disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. So what does the government want to do, right? We want to pay back this debt. We are doing this through like cutting like social development, right? We are like cutting pay equity. We are like minimizing people's access to like benefits, right? This is like detrimentally impacting these like poor communities because not only is the country already just struggling to pay back this debt, but we are also like as a result like detrimentally impacting these marginalized communities because of it, right? And they are just like, this ends up with people just being stuck in this cycle of struggle, right? They are stuck being marginalized because the country is in too much debt to actually reinvest, right? And it's just this constant struggle, right? So what are we going to gain from taxing the rich, right? Even if you don't buy that, like taxing the rich on their like property and stuff is actually going to, even if you don't buy anything about what we said about them developing land, right? We are still going to see direct benefits. So even if you don't buy any of the strong points we've given you about them developing land, we are still going to be able to benefit marginalized communities without them developing their land. How? Because we are taxing them on the inherent value that their property beholds, which is high, right? So when we implement these like taxes on the land, right, they are going to pay them back. We already tell you this because like if they had like the ability to like pay for like all this land in the first place, they probably have the ability to like pay this tax anyways, right? So first of all, like we see that just like this money that we get from those taxes, we are able to like better off like pay off those debts, right? We are going to like pay off those debts. We don't have to cut as much like social investment, right? Which directly helps our marginalized communities, okay? We see that like we are going to have to stop cutting things like pay equity, right? So these marginalized communities that Thora talked about with the development and stuff, not only just like do get better paying jobs, but also like we're going to see like people just having like access, better like investment and stuff. So this is really important, right? Because we tell you our path to victory is to like divide, like stop this divide between the wealthy and the poor, right? Between the marginalized and these like landowners who are like rich and stuff and not developing anything, right? We tell you that even if you don't buy anything that Thora has brought up about how like development is going to be directed into these poorer communities and that is going to help them. Even if you don't buy that, we tell you that there is another way in which we can see this development, right? We tell you that like the tax, even if the like rich aren't developing this land, the tax is going to end up like directly going to the government, which then they are going to pay off those debts and they are going to directly reinvest that into social investment, which helps these poor communities to get jobs, it helps them to access benefits, it helps them to pay off their houses, it helps them to like get access to jobs, and it helps them to just survive. Thank you.
We thank the second speaker of the Affirmative speech and would now like to invite the second speaker of the Negating up to say before and continue.
the whole affirmative case relies on this idea of rich people actually wanting to invest their money and actually do something with it. We see this is where it fails. Okay, two things in this debate. Firstly, I'll be responding to a large amount of the affirmative case and also be extending upon my substantive case of RC. Okay, well, firstly, I'd like to tackle this idea that they bring up of rich people wanting to as they put it, make their land productive for free responses. You just see, it's really unlikely these rich people are gonna actually want to do this for free reasons. Firstly, we see they're already rich. If I have enough money to build a tennis court on a random piece of land, why would I want to, why would I then want to spend more money, more time, more resources actually wanting to, make more money, Secondly, because we see rich people often, they have a lot of time. They have a lot of things to do, They probably got like 3 companies here, another 3 companies over there, 7 jets and all that kind of stuff. You'll see they're very time poor. Meaning they don't. Not only are they unlikely to want to put money into these kinds of things to pay off a tax that is probably, a tax that is not characterized to be
Point of interest.
not a lot of money, likely not to be a substantial enough amount of money to make them worry about paying the tax, to make them worry about that kind of thing. But secondly, it's also just, it's like an inconvenience to them. And really, what this also means is that a lot of the benefits that they try to talk about, using this tax to pump into the government and then uplift all these communities, don't really stand because A, they haven't done a good enough job of defining how much this tax actually is, and B, they haven't done a good enough job at saying why it's likely that these rich people are gonna want to actually make their land productive. Another thing is,
Point of interest.
Right. Anyways, they also talked about how in this point of government information, how they talk a lot about the social development and paying the debt. This is like one of the really big pushes we hear from this side. They say one of their paths to victory is actually proving that they can get all the social development. They can help uplift all these marginalized communities. A free response to this. You see, firstly, it's unlikely that a lot of these businesses and companies are going to want to work and buy these low-value lands for a few reasons. Firstly, it's just because they don't see enough profit incentive there. There's obviously a reason why these places are low socioeconomic areas, because there's not enough money there, there's not enough jobs there already. Yes, they bring up a good point that they could create these jobs, but in terms of creating these jobs, they need to upskill the people, they need to train them, they need to put, there has to be incentives there, and that's just things that they lack. And secondly, we just see it's a really big hassle for these companies. They have to move operations there, they have to get HR, they need to go hire people, A lot of the time, they don't think about the setup costs that go into developing these areas. They live in this world where everything costs like $2 to set up a business. I can just throw a McDonald's into the middle of like a bush and it's going to make me millions of dollars and I'm going to uplift all the people and get rid of this wealth divide. That's not how the world works. There's a lot of nuances that the other team doesn't really think about. Meaning that at the end of this, a lot of these points around like this wealth divide being closed don't really stand on their side of the house. And in actuality, if you listen to what my first speaker talked about in terms of taxation on the businesses and on these buildings, we actually get a far greater degree of tax. As he brought up, it's a 25% tax on these buildings, which means in actuality, the government will be getting a lot more money, meaning that we might be actually able to get these benefits to the we might be able to actually able to get these benefits to these welfare systems, to these marginalized communities that they so greatly want to stand for. I will take a point if there is one.
Yeah, just when you were talking about rich people and how they don't care about making more money, shouldn't the same thing stand that they're then fine with paying the tax, which is then just going to go back into those like marginalized communities?
People see that's the problem. You haven't told us how much this tax is. Is it $100? Is it $1,000? What's the point of saying there's a tax and not telling us how much this tax is? Because that's key to your guys' argument. If this tax is small, it means it doesn't make as much of an impact as you want it to be. That's why we have to find how much the tax is on our side of the house. We can create tangible change with the evidence to show you how much change we're creating. Something like that. Anyways, yeah. They also talked a lot about how, so at the end of that point, a lot of that stuff just doesn't stand. Anyways, they also, moving on, they talked about increased productivity. This is another really big push from this side of the house. At this point, it's also really contingent on these rich people, firstly, being incentivized enough to want to, make these kinds of things in this area, and secondly, having the time and capacity to actually want to do this stuff. A free response to this. Firstly, we just see if this tax is low enough for them to pay. As I said before, they're probably just likely going to pay it because they don't want to spend more money than they would just paying the tax, developing these businesses, and then paying for their stuff to be built and all their other auxiliary costs. But secondly, we just see rich people probably have other avenues that they can just pull money in from, which is kind of defeats the purpose of this whole point of productivity. And then we just see rich people already don't get taxed much in New Zealand and much in a lot of other countries anyway, so it's unlikely that they're gonna stick to these kinds of tax rules that they in place.
Okay. Point of interest.
No, thank you. Anyway. And thirdly, it's just likely that rich people are gonna find loopholes because that's what rich people like doing. They want to conserve their money. They want to keep their money. A rich person is not gonna sit and look at a tax and go, "I should pay that like a legal citizen. I should be a good person." No, the rich person is gonna find loopholes. They don't think about the incentives of a rich person. Yes, I will take a point if there is.
Yeah. When you talk about rich people just finding money from other avenues, does this not still just end up in like a tax which makes it like around 15% from being paid, helping marginalized communities?
What?
Yeah.
Anyways, moving on from that very odd point, they also talk about again, back on the point of marginalized communities, which is again another really big push from their side. That was the two major pushes we heard. This idea of getting rid of this wealth gap and improving marginalized communities. And if I can prove to you that these don't stand and that we get better taxation on our side of the house, we in fact win this debate. So what did we hear? We heard that the likelihood of we heard that it's contingent on these companies seeing enough potential in these areas. And as I've just stated to you, it's simply unlikely because the profit margins aren't there, the development isn't there. There's not enough profit margin incentive in these low socioeconomic areas, in these marginalized communities, for them to want to get there. So in actuality, what we see on their side of the house is what my first speaker talked about, an inflation in land markets. Because yes, cheap land is good, but cheap land will likely be bad land. And why would companies be incentivized to go build on cheap land if it's bad? Companies don't buy cheap land because it's bad. They want the good land. That's why the good land costs more money. That's like, as we've talked about, it's easier and better to build up. It's better to build, to use the good land because it's in key areas that will make money for these companies, like cities, like CBDs, like those areas, because that's where the money is for these companies. The money's not in a random suburb in the middle of Wellington. It's in the city centre. That's why on this side of the house they don't get development there at all. Yes. And lastly, on this idea lastly on the point they talk about of farmers also. They talk about how farmers will likely, try and max out the capacity because again, they're one of the biggest landholders in the concept of debate. A few responses. First, you see, farmers are already really stretched out to their limit, and what you do with this tax is take away from that money that they're already struggling to get, meaning they only put more strain on the farming market. Farmers already, the cost of farming are already very exuberant, meaning it's likely that these farmers probably don't have the capacity to pay these kinds of taxes in the first place, and it's also likely that farmers won't have the capacity to keep making it more productive, which means at the end of this, a lot of these claims don't stand, and that is why you should negate. Proud to negate. Thank you. You can't just say my name in the debate. You can't just say my name.
Not give him back. Give him back.
I'm trying to yell, please.
We thank the second speaker of the negating team for their speech, and would now like to invite the third speaker of the affirmative team
This debate comes down to three main points of clash. How this will influence kind of land prices, the value of land, the effectivity of tax, and the impact on marginalized communities. If we can prove a significant positive impact in any one of these areas, we can prove that our path to victory, which is decreasing the wealth inequality gaps, can be fulfilled and that we should win this debate. To start on sort of the land prices. One of the big pushes we hear from the negating team is how this is going to have like very poor impacts on land prices, right? These are just going to fluctuate massively depending on the tax put on them. What we hear from first, what we hear from second, is that there is an inherent value of land. And I'm going to reiterate this now. things like farmland, things like prime area in a CBD, these kind of lands are like really sought after, right? Farmland, it's fertile, it's like flat, it's the kind of place where you can make a lot of money in farming, right? CBD areas, of course, like the big finance bros, they want that for their big banking firms, right? Because obviously that's exactly where they can make all the money. For these reasons, this land is always going to stay pretty relatively constant in being like high value, right? Like we tell you through first and second again, the high value of these lands before the tax is implemented even, and even after the tax, means that this is kind of like relatively accessible to kind of like the richer, like the better off socioeconomic people in our society, right? As we point out, like these people have a lot of money. They can afford to like sit on this land, and like the negating team kind of does misunderstand, the beautiful capitalist dream of having like a really nice house and a big pool on a large spread of land, right, means that rich people are more than happy to, in most cases where there's like no further incentive to develop it, are more like happy just to sit on it, right? This is not really good for anyone, or not good for like wider society when we can incentivize them to do better things with this land, or at least benefit off it, right? I think we kind of like pretty well proved that like the sort of the land prices will stay like pretty strong. But on one kind of like last point in this, we do hear this point from like the negating team that like cheap land is bad land under our model, right? We just want to say that like this is not what we're saying. Cheap land is the land which isn't like actively like really easy to use for like say farming, right? It's often the land that we see in like sort of like worse off communities, right? And it's like not very good, say, in like farming, but there's no reason that this can't be like invested in to put like businesses, like small like local community businesses, which can be used to like increase jobs in this region, right? And I'm going to get into why we think this is going to happen, right? Or secondly, on the effectivity of this tax, we hear this big push from the negating team that like because we aren't like giving a value of this tax, there's like no way to know like what this number or like how this will affect, right? We kind of tell you that like no matter what, having more money coming in like mostly from like the rich people is going to be like a good thing for like marginalized communities when we reinvest here. But if they really want a number, we'll like give them a number. I don't know, like 15%, something around that. Like a number that's like pretty like easily payable for like someone who is able to afford like these really, really good pieces of land. Like at the sort of the peak of like land value, that's what you pay. And then of course like down to like these marginalized communities, like they're paying like sub 1%, right? This is gonna have like no effect on them like as of the moment, and for that reason like it's not going to like poorly affect them. It just like gets money out of rich people, right? Secondly, on the effectivity of tax, they like to tell us that like rich people will just find money from like other avenues, right? They'll get it elsewhere rather than developing their land, right? Of course, this isn't like an ideal solution because we have like told you the benefits that we get out of development. Like we get more food, we get more farming, which is things that makes like food cheaper. It's going to be like really good for everyone in New Zealand. People like in marginalized communities say are going to be able to like more easily access healthy food. But even if like you don't buy that, we're telling you that these rich people are going to pay this tax, right? They tell us that like they don't pay tax now, they won't pay tax then, right? That is like in the most cases through legal loopholes, right? We're telling you we're putting like this 15% tax like in place on these top levels, and this is a tax that will be paid by the people, right? That is not something that you can like loophole your way out of. For these reasons, we think it's pretty likely that they will pay it, right? Secondly, we hear like just to like reiterate this thing about like the rich people not wanting to like invest in the land and make it productive, right? We know that like especially in like these higher socioeconomic areas, there's like a really high drive. Like rich people love to get richer. Like tell me one person that's rich that isn't trying to like maximize that to like a higher extent, right? Like we look at like any billionaire, they want more money. Like most people, I think everyone wants more money, right? At the end of the day, right? And there's no reason that they won't like try to do this, right? We see this like when this tax goes in, there is like a pretty high incentive for them because it's not nothing. Because there is like a pretty high incentive that they are going to go and they are going to like find ways to try make it like cheaper for them, right? And one of the like big pushes that we give you is that they will invest in farming. They will invest in like better infrastructure on this land that they can use it to like make more capital gains, which is like going to be good for them, and it's going to be good for our system because that goes back into the system, right? I think this kind of like shows that there is like pretty good effectivity of tax here, and like given what we're telling you, I think like no matter the number, but like especially with the numbers we've given you, it's very likely that this is like a sufficient amount of money that is going to make like a really big dent on like the beneficiaries and like the subsidization that we want to put into marginalized communities, right? Finally, then on the impact of marginal communities. we hear like a big like push from like the Negating team that like businesses do not want to like move to poor areas. And one of their big pushes here is like about like us, if we're saying that like cheap land is bad, then they won't want to move here. Like we've told you, this isn't the case. Cheap land is like often cheap just because like it can't be like so easily utilized in like primary industry, right? But there's still a lot of other like kind of businesses in our country, right? And we also tell you that like businesses do have a profit incentive. They are completely right here, but this profit incentive means that they want to like try get like the least tax possible. This means that like especially smaller businesses, right? Like in particular, these are going to be the kind of businesses that are like trying to move to these areas, right? We see like we see like builders, we see like more dairies. These kind of businesses, like small kind of community things, are going to be like moving to these areas. As we've told you, this like results in more jobs, right? When you have more jobs, like just by the virtue of having them, it means you need more people to employ. When you're in these kind of areas, which we know that they will be because it's so cheap and they have this profit incentive, it is very likely that these are like the people in these like poorer socioeconomic situations are the ones that are going to be hiring, right? As we've told you, and like as we hear in this text, like the value of like property and stuff on the land is not like inherently going to change the value of that land or like increase your tax, right? This is really important here because we now tell you that people in marginalized communities are going to be getting like higher paying jobs, right? There will be more jobs available. They will be able to get jobs and they can go and they can like renovate their houses. They can make sure that they have better living conditions, right? We see this as being incredibly important. The children of marginalized like people in these kind of lower socioeconomic sort of conditions are going to grow up healthier. They're going to grow up happier. They'll spend less time sick. They won't be in like mold-infested houses, and they're going to be able to go out. They'll spend more time at school. They'll get like a better education because of this, and they're going to go out and be able to have like a better life and have like a better impact on the world. We've also told you, like, with this tax money, we're going to be able to like make sure that we continue to like have equity for the people in New Zealand, right? We see this as being really important. Throughout our whole thing, we kind of like show you how like this money or like this tax is going to like really specifically like benefit of like the money of like rich people, right? And it's going to be like distributed just by nature, by the fact that like businesses want to go into like smaller communities, and then by the fact that the government will be reinvesting in these communities, right, to bridge the like pay like the wealth equity gap and like create a better like society for New Zealand. Thank you.
And we thank the first speaker of the Affirmative for their speech, and now like to invite the third speaker of the Negating team up to take the floor to continue the
Affirming claim that rich people let this land sit around, that they're inherently selfish and want to continue making money. In the same breath, they claim that their burden is to help marginalized communities and to bridge the wealth gap. Firstly, I just want to note that the bar they set for themselves is far too high for this debate. I don't think they needed to prove that they closed the wealth gap at all. I think they just needed to prove that, I guess, they just get better infrastructure. They get better infrastructure and like faster, and that was enough to cater to people. Right. Okay. What am I going to go over to you in this debate? In my speech. Firstly, I'm going to go over infrastructure as to why, like, even if it's like faster and even if you get more of it, why it's likely to be worse, and why the issue of landowners not building infrastructure on their own land isn't necessarily a problem first place. And secondly, I'll deal with their alleged path to victory, which is the wealth gap, as to why that just like never happens. Okay. The first thing to say underneath infrastructure is that basically their entire claim on infrastructure is that what a land value tax essentially does is it puts pressure on landowners to build infrastructure, right? 3 responses. Firstly, note that like on our side of the house and on either side of the house, people don't buy land to put their house on it. People buy land because it's an investment, right? The difference is on our side of the house, you have to pay for like $4 million straight up, whereas on their side of the house, they have to pay it gradually, and we think that's far worse. But either way, we think that you want to get return for that $4 million for all the reasons that we stated at first. Secondly, because we also stated how like lobbyists, like companies and corporations, also tend to wave checks in these landowners' face and say, hey, I want to build my company here. I want to build this building here. I'm going to give you X% of like profits from this company in order to build my building here. That's another reason why landowners are likely to build infrastructure. And thirdly, which is just like the most intuitive thing to point out here, is how on earth did these people get enough money to buy a soccer court and like a farmland in general? And that is because oftentimes these people are business owners, which means that the likely thing of what they're buying land for is so that they utilize land for business, right? They claim that the reason why landowners are likely to let their just buy land for $4 million and just let it sit. We tell you, you need to weigh this on proximity, right? Because we think that's a more proximate incentive for a rich person to buy land for the investment of it and to generate more income due to the incentives that they gave us, as opposed to just like building a house on it, right? So what do we think happens instead? 2 things. Firstly, like rich people need to like bridge the gap, right? They say that they bridge the gap through like making deals and like profiting off of infrastructure, right? But we tell you that like if these like landowners are like sort of communicating with these companies, it increases the price. The price sort of flows down from the landowner to the company, to the consumer that benefits off of the company or the apartment or whatever they're trying to build, right? And note that throughout this entire debate, all of our material on like why these people are just likely to sort of avoid costs, cut costs by really cheap materials, and ultimately create poor infrastructure that breaks down and is not durable, got entirely ignored because we think that's a huge harm on their side of the house. Because even if you get more infrastructure, which is their best case scenario, like this infrastructure is like not the best, right? It's more likely to be susceptible to things like mold, it's likely to be cheap, and it's likely to break down over time. But no, also the material that we gave you about how oftentimes this cost gets passed down to consumers, and note that those consumers tend to be the vulnerable people that they're talking about with the wealth gap. I'll get into that more now, but before I do, I'll take a point.
When you talk about like how building an infrastructure cut corners to make profit, don't you think if they could make profit, like if they could do that now, they would also do it to make profit? I don't get like why that would happen more on our side of the house.
Well, the thing, actually, I can remember that. Yes, I'll talk about that. Okay, on the wealth gap, right? Okay, high burden here, but I'm going to explain why they don't do this. This part is separated into 2 points. Firstly, on their ability to tax the rich, and secondly, on development of their land. All right, let's talk about taxing the rich. The first thing to say here is that like the majority of the case lies on the fact that farmers are rich. I've already stated, like farmers are at capacity, right? Oftentimes, what's happening, what's like tends to happen is that they don't tend to be that rich. They don't tend to generate that much money off of farmland, and therefore we think that they're the ones that are likely to struggle, and those are the people that we need to help out if their industries are so core to like the economy, right? But also note that we literally tax them more for all of the reasons we gave you, right? Because the tax that you put like on business on buildings oftentimes has more regulation and more different types of taxes associated with it, but also because it's just more frequent, right? Because it happens every like financial year as opposed to like or like every 6 months as opposed to like just having it once a year, and oftentimes that price is adjusted with like the quality of the buildings and that kind of thing, so therefore we think that we tax them more. Therefore, if they say that the like in the worst case they like tax the rich, note that we likely tax the rich more because we tax the companies more, we tax the businesses that are building on these lands more, right? But also note that like all the material we gave you at Alex about how the cost essentially just trickles down to the consumer, right? Because if landowners are making deals with people who want to build stuff on their land, if it's an apartment block, for example, and it's now going to cost more to put that apartment block there, who do you think is paying for that apartment block? Because I don't think it's the people who's building the apartment. It's probably the people who's going to be living in the apartment, and those are the most vulnerable people that they never end up helping, right? You know why? So therefore, we think at like the end of this, like ultimately, if they want to claim that the solution to like dividing wealth gap is taxing the rich, essentially, we think that we tax the rich more because, like, firstly, there's just more tax associated when you have more nuance because you're building like really high infrastructure buildings as opposed to flat land. But then, just like secondly, like taxing the rich on their side, they just tax the less on scale. Okay. Secondly, on development through land, they claim, and this is like really weird here, right? They claim that people, that these rich people will invest in low socioeconomic communities. Like 3 responses. Firstly, I want to just say this can kind of be a problem sometimes, right? In instances like gentrification, right? Because oftentimes, when you have like these rich people trying to bring their corporations into low socioeconomic communities, they've never proven to us why these communities will not be flooded out, or like why this is not like a bad thing anyway, or like why other people aren't likely to take those jobs. But secondly, note that you still need to like train and upskill people, which diminishes all of the benefits that they get in terms of like jobs and providing job opportunities. Because oftentimes these like large company owners are likely to give jobs to like their friends or like neighboring companies and those kind of people. They never essentially explain why this improves situations for marginalized communities in those areas. But thirdly, like note that people just don't invest in land that's like less like fertile, like less valuable in the eyes of the survey, as they noted at first. This means that at the end of this point, we don't think that they necessarily even reach the burden of wealth gap, but at the end of this like debate, we think that they don't even like meet the burden of being able to provide sufficient infrastructure. We don't think that they meet the burden of being able to provide adequate living situations for people, and that was the bar that they never met.
Cool. As is customary, we will now reverse the speaking order and invite the leader of the negating team up to wrap up their
Affirmative's biggest push is that the tax creates a prosperous economic change on their side of the house. Their whole case, as mentioned at Cattell, is contingent on rich people actually willing to allow for all this productivity that they try to claim. Even then, Affirmative fails to realize that not only rich people own land. For example, Modi people own land as they're given it by the government. Are they now expected to pay this? Now they need to pay off their own debt. But even if we do buy into this idea that the stable tax will allow greater economy, there are still a lot of issues here. Firstly, they fail to understand the impacts on minorities. For example, what about the impoverished people who live in cheap apartments? It's now expected for them to pay more on their side of the house due to the tax, right? The flip here is that on our side of the house, the price is always, and there is no more issues that are given to them. On their side of the house, when this tax comes into play, the person who owns the land is going to say, okay, I need to charge more to the people who live here so I can make back the money that I'm possibly losing from the tax. Which is why these people, these minority groups, such as the people who are in poverty, who are living in these cheap, already unstable apartments, now have to pay more and possibly lose out on their housing. But secondly, there's just going to be worse infrastructure. Businesses invest in land, but when they start to cut corners to stay more cost effective, because they need to pay more. This looks like things like proper toiletries are becoming poorer, right? So like let's say a lack of facilities. But more importantly, again, linking back to like the minorities, this could look like less like period products for women, right? They're cutting corners on things they don't think is necessary because they can just get away with it. Note here, as Manumi has said, this was really like lowly contested from the affirmative team, and when it was contested, it was a bit too late. All of this is quite important for these minority groups. But if we flip this now and look at our side of the house, we'll show you 3 outcomes. Okay, firstly, we'll show that high-cost areas maintain a stable trend. They're not going to start fluctuating, and for the people who live in this area, it's going to be a lot better for them because they're not going to have to be constantly watching for how much they have to pay. But secondly, land also sees better stability, right? There's no good or bad trends here. Sure, they can claim it's going to be good, but in saying that, can they also predict it's going to be really good? But what happens if it's really bad, right? On our side of the house, we have the idea that it's going to be certain, it's going to stay stable. But also, thirdly, the land maintains a desirability. There's no heavy fluctuations in desirability, and it's always going to stay stable. But okay, let's take a step back and let's weigh the outcomes of both sides of the house. What does AF push? AF push 2 main things here. Firstly, they push like the wealth divide and equalization, but they also push productivity. But no, here, this is like quite contingent on the rich, as mentioned earlier. Yes, the rich want to stay rich, but like, will they truly invest in all of the stuff that Affirmative tried to claim? They, from time and time again, but there's just like no sufficient mechanization, or there is some, but there's not enough mechanization to convince me or anyone else really here that they want to do this, right? The only incentive that we're given is because they want to stay rich, but that isn't enough. So what does our side of the house push? Well, we again push 2 things. Firstly, we push the incentive to build a better society, but we also push more money overall. So how do we get more money overall? Well, as we've heard at first, second, and third, it's just quite logical, right? The money no longer goes straight to the government, it stays within the public sector, so the money stays within the people who need to use it and not the government who is now getting the money from the tax. So at the end of this case, what do we need to do? Well, AF comes out here and they provide a lot of information about like, oh, we're going to do this, but it actually does not offer an adequate living condition. What do we do? Well, we do a couple of things. There's going to be a lot better impacts for people who are in minority groups. But in saying that, we're going to be able to help a lot more people than Affirmative can. We're able to help all the people who live in, let's say, a really high-cost city, because now the money that we've mentioned earlier stays within that public sector, and it's not directly going to the government like it would be on Affirmative's side of the house. Opposed.
We thank the leader of the Negating team for their speech, and would now like to invite the leader of the Affirmative team up to wrap up their case and conclude today.
Look, we outlined at the start of today's debate that our path to victory is to prove to you that people in New Zealand are going to be better off on our side through helping marginalized communities, right? We are going to show you in today's reply that we provide multiple paths for this. Even if one path doesn't work, we still provide another because the negating side has not provided anything sufficient on their own to actually prove why it is better for them on their side. Now, going through our clashes, which Asa identified, and then going on to the incentives of rich people. So our first clash about like fluctuating land prices, right? We tell you, from the neg side, they tell us that it's like prices are always fluctuating and stuff, that they change value over time, right? What we gave you as a pushback to this is like stuff from the info slide, stuff from the MOOC to tell you that they have inherent value based on their like development capability, right? We tell you that like the high places that have higher development will start off with like a higher value, right? Places that don't will have a lower value, right? So simply like, even like if this point isn't won by us, I'm still going to prove to you why overall we're going to win, but I still believe like this point has been kind of knocked out. Then on the effectivity of tax, right? They tell us that like on their side, they kind of just like tax more frequently and stuff, and that they like have higher tax. ACE already gives you a number about like 50% tax. We always tell you that if rich people aren't going to develop their land, it still means that they have like that higher like productive that development like capability, right? Which means that they are always going to have like a high value. So even if rich people aren't developing their land and like paying back the government through that way, we tell you that they're just going to be paying like this high tax because of that inherent value, right? And we still have like infrastructural development because we tell you that like rich people will develop, as I'm going to go into my incentives, right? But we also tell you that like small businesses are going to invest in like other like lower value lands, right? Which links into the infrastructural development, right? Then impacts on marginalized communities. And this is the point that you should weigh the highest because it's our path to victory and they cannot prove that they actually really benefit marginalized communities that much because we, So the next side tells us that basically, like, no one's going to want to buy cheap land, and so therefore everything we say about, like, investment in marginalized communities just doesn't work. Well, the two pushbacks we're giving you on this, right? We tell you that, like, smaller businesses are more likely to invest in this land, right? Because they, like, pay less tax. And even, like, bigger businesses, even if they aren't doing it as often, they're still doing it because they pay less tax, right? So this looks like dairies, as Asa told you. This looks like housing developments, right? Which just, like, directly benefit these marginalized communities because it's offering jobs, it's offering better living conditions, right? And we have given you, like, many long-term impacts to this as to why this is going to improve their living situations. But even if you, like, don't directly buy that, right, we tell you that, like, the development that we're going to get from rich people, like, developing their land, as I'm going to get into my incentives, just overall provides, like, more development into our, like, communities, right? We have, like, more, we have just more, like, development, infrastructural development in New Zealand. That means, like, the government's able to, like, pay off their debt and invest in social, like, services, right? Now we get onto the incentives of rich people, right? We both kind of agree that, like, rich people kind of want to keep their money, but we kind of, like, say this in different ways. We tell you that they, like, want their money and they're, like, buying all this land, right? And the way that they keep their money is they're going to develop further into this land, right? We also tell you that, like, in order to, like, keep their money too, they're going to, like, we tell you that they're going to, like, invest maybe in, like, businesses on their land or invest in farmland, like, give you several mix for this, right? They tell us that, like, these rich people, like, want money, right? And they're going to do it through, like, selling their land, right? Because they, like, inherently, like, want this investment, right? So we both kind of just agree that rich people, like, want to have money, right? Want to invest, want to develop, right, overall, and, like, have that money going back to them. But we're proving to you, like, on our side of the house, we get that more. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the debate. If you guys would make your way outside, I think I will take around 12 minutes or so in order to make a complete deliberation. I will
You wait till tonight. You wait. Oh, nice.
Oh, is it still
You, I was like cooking something up. And then you said my name.
So good.